Shalom and welcome to Ta'alumot Ba'ivrit, Secrets in Hebrew. Today we're going to look at something in Parshat Bo, which means to come, which is in the book of Exodus, and it's specifically in Exodus chapter 12 that we're going to look at. So Exodus chapter 12 is a very famous chapter. It's where the Passover was actually instituted, that we see written in the Torah. And it gives us good details on the exodus from Egypt of the Jewish people and something that is called the Erev Rav, which is a multitude of people. Erev Rav, the great multitude, a mixed multitude is actually what it means. And what this is showing, the reason it says here, it's actually in Exodus chapter 12, verse 38. It says, V'gam Erev Rav ala itam. It says, and also a mixed multitude went up with them. And when it says with them, it's talking about with the Jewish people that were in Egypt and that were coming out of Egypt. So it says an Erev Rav came with them. This is very important to understand because this is going to help us have a lot of insight and clarity today that there's a big confusion on in much of Christianity today. Wondering, are you the church? Are you Israel? There's this two house solution that is actually not biblical. And so we're going to get to see something really interesting today in regards to the Erev Rav. And so the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude, is actually a mixed multitude of every tribe, tongue, and nation. So we see that it wasn't just the Jewish people that God brought out of Egypt. There were many people that proselytized themselves, that grafted themselves into the Jewish people to follow the God of Israel out of Egypt and into the wilderness to receive the Torah. Okay, this is very, very amazing here. So let's take a look here at Erev Rav. Erev Rav in Exodus 12, verse 38. Okay, Erev Rav is equivalent in gematria to 474. Okay, this is the same gematria as the word adat. Okay, $474, and the Erev Rav. This is the word for mixed multitude. Okay, mixed multitude is Erev Rav, 474. Adat is a word for congregation, or assembly, if you will. Okay, either one is fine. Congregation or assembly. Okay, so Erev Rav, mixed multitude, is equivalent to congregation or assembly, adat. Adat, we actually see it used a couple times in Exodus 12. It's not a new word by any means. And it's in Exodus 12:3. It says, Dabru el kol adat Israel. Speak to all of the assembly of Israel, or all of the congregation of Israel. And then we actually see it again here in verse 19 in Exodus 12. It says, Shivat yamim shor lo yimatzeh b'vatechem. It says, 7 days you shall not find or have leaven in your houses. Ki kol ochel machmetzet. All who eat leaven, v'nichrata hanefesh hahi me'adat Israel. That soul shall be cut off from the assembly of Israel. And then it goes on to say in that same verse, Bager uva ezrach haaretz. The ger, which is the Gentile that grafts themselves in, and the native of the land. So notice what it just says in verse 19 alone. It says that the ger and the native born, so the Gentile that grafts themselves into Israel and the born Jew, are both Adat Israel. And so Adat Israel, whenever God is giving these these rules and regulations, a dot is equivalent to the Erev Rav. So the mixed multitudes, the Gentiles that grafted themselves in to follow the God of Israel, that graft themselves in to be a part of what God is giving to the Jewish people, are all Adat Israel, all the assembly of Israel. It's one people, okay? And just how he says there in Exodus 12:19, he repeats it later in Exodus 12:48, 49, and 50, that he says that there is one Torah for the Ger and for the native, for the Ezrach. Okay. Now here's an important thing that we have to understand. In the New Testament, there is a word for church, and in the Greek it's ecclesia, but in the Hebrew this is a word that's used over 100 times in the Tanakh. It's the word kahal. Okay? And it means assembly. This is the word that's commonly translated as church in the New Testament. And so much of Christianity today, and it's not a good theology to have. We have to come to a revelation of this understanding. Much of the Christian church today says, no, there is the church and there's Israel. God is coming to rescue the church. There is no covenant with the church. Please understand. There's a covenant with Israel. People say, no, well, the new covenant is with the church. No. The new covenant is actually described in Jeremiah 31 through 35. And it says in a new covenant he's going to make with Israel and with Judah. Okay. And it doesn't say with the church. This confusion has come because of the language, hop over from the Greek. This is the reason why we have this misconception with the New Testament. Now, notice how I said that the word kahal, that's actually the word for church in the New Testament. It means assembly, but so does adat. It means assembly. So what's the difference? Okay, kahal is simply a smaller congregation of the adat, of the assembly. So I'll give you an example. Myself and my wife started Revelation Church. Okay, we have what is called a kehilah, which comes from the word kahal. Okay. Now I have a friend and mentor that's in Florida, Pastor Matt. He has a kehilah, which comes from the word kahal. Okay, there are people that have different synagogues. They have their kehilah, which are, in plural it's kehilot. So I have a kehilah, they have a kehilah, this person has a kehilah. We each have our own kahal, but which is the word in English that we get from the Greek church. Okay, but the thing is, when we all come together as a whole, not as individual synagogues and kehilahs, all of us as a whole, we are adat. That's the difference between the two words congregation. There's many congregations, but all of us together equal the adat, the congregation of Israel. Okay? And so there is not meant to be a different Torah or a different way of following or a different thought process as far as discipleship goes and following the Jewish Messiah, Yeshua. No matter whether you're Jew or Gentile, in regards to whether you think you're part of the church or Israel, we are. If you're not part of Israel, you're not part of the covenants of God. Yeshua, his sacrifice has now allowed Gentiles to come and graft themselves in to be a part of the covenants and to join Adat Israel, the assembly or congregation of Israel. And actually, my rabbi, in his new book, The Besorah According to COVID-19, he actually touched on this subject on page 265. He says, it is clear that Yeshua did not instruct Peter to create a new institution that is called the church, but rather to create communities of the Messiah for Jewish people that also welcomes non-Jews who want to accept the Jewishness of the good news. The term that is used in the Greek, ecclesia, or in Hebrew, kahal, is defined by the lexicon as an assembly of Jews. Even in the Greek translation of the Torah, the term ecclesia that appears 35 times does not refer even once to a non-Jewish gathering. Yeshua is simply instructing Peter to establish first an authentic Messianic Jewish community as a model in Jerusalem. It is important that the Gentiles who approach the city in order to build the wide road leading into it understand that the city's boundaries cannot be changed. Often, Christians who become connected to the roots of the faith try to make Messianic Judaism a form of Christianity with a light flavor of Judaism. It is clear, however, that the city of the rebuilt house of Israel has a standard known as the Torah. The city has laws and regulations that are required by all who want to build the city. Okay, and so this is important to understand, is that even in the New Testament, we see in the book of Acts, as Paul is going from city to city, Paul is going and teaching to people in synagogues, which is the word kehilah, but in the English, from the Greek, it translates it to the word church, from the Greek word ekklesia. He is teaching to Jew and Gentile and teaching about the Jewish Messiah from the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And the Jew and the Gentile that joins the house of Israel is taking in the same doctrine and the same teachings and living according to the Jewish Messiah. Okay, so this is very, very important. And so just know that in the New Testament, when we see the word church, the word church is coming from the Greek word ekklesia, which is actually the Hebrew word kahal, which means assembly or congregation. And if you are a part of this, you are a part of the greater congregation, the Adat Israel, the house of Israel. Erev Rav, the mixed multitude of Gentiles, is a part of the Adat, the congregation of Israel. And just how it says in Exodus 12 and verse 19, that it was the Ger, the Gentile that grasped themselves in, and the Ezrach, the native-born Jew, are both part of Adat Israel and are both taking hold of the same Torah and the same Jewish Messiah. This is very, very important in these last days for us to become unified in the house of Israel under one halakha, under one law, and that's the Torah of the Messiah that was being taught from the Torah of Moses. And through this, we come into one heart and one mind, dressing Yeshua, the Jewish Messiah, in his proper garments. Shalom and Kol Tuv.